Okay, this video is over metabolism. I'm going to be very direct on what I want you to know. So when I say you need to know this, it means you need to know that. So make sure you're writing that down. So now we're going to talk about, we've talked about the three fuel nutrients, carbohydrates, fats, and proteins. Now we're going to talk about how they become ATP, the energy that's needed in order to do work, whether it's active transport, muscle contraction, moving neurotransmitters, anything like that. How do they become the energy in the form of ATP that we need? So the energy cycle starts with the sun. So we're kind of going back to the really big picture here. All energy ultimately comes from the sun and in the form of nuclear energy. So here are the equations. Okay, the sun gives us light. Okay, so what plants do, and yes, we need plants in order to get this energy we're talking about. Without plants, we couldn't have what we need. What plants are going to do, plants are going to take carbon dioxide from the air, water, and light, and they are going to produce oxygen and carbohydrates, whether it's a single glucose or whether it is starch, like we talked about when we talked about the fuel nutrients. So this is what plants are going to do. Plants had to exist on this planet before animals did because we needed oxygen to survive and we needed energy. We needed energy in the form of glucose or starch. What animals are going to do then is we're going to use the oxygen and we're going to use the glucose to make energy. And what animals then do, what we do, is we take this oxygen and this carbohydrate and we're going to make ATP, which is energy. The byproducts of that is we're going to make water and carbon dioxide. So carbon dioxide is a waste product, water is a waste product, and then we get this energy that we need in order for muscle contraction, active transport, all the different things we've talked about that involve energy. So plants take CO2, water, and light, make what we need, and then what we need, we use the oxygen. This is aerobic metabolism. We'll talk about anaerobic metabolism also. We can take glucose, we can take starch and break it down into glucoses, and we use this to make the energy we need, and then we have the waste products, CO2 and water. We can also then take proteins and fats and fill them into this system of metabolism to also get ATP. And with fat, we actually end up getting more ATP than we would with glucose. Because remember, we talked about fats have more carbon bonds. The more bonds you have, the more energy you can get. So we fit fat into the system and actually get more energy than we would if we just burned or used glucose. Proteins, we can get energy also, but remember, protein's not very efficient, and we really don't want to be using protein in order to make this ATP because we're breaking down muscle, including the heart, in order to do that. So we can use it, we just don't really want to. And then we use the energy to do the work, whether it's neurons firing, liver doing liver things, muscle contraction, all the things we talked about that's going to take energy. We're going to get the ATP. We're going to use ATP in order to do that. And then the waste product, when we blow out CO2, the plants can actually do that, use that. So here's a very simplistic model of ATP. This last bond, whenever we break a bond, we make energy. Okay, we make energy that can be used to do work. So the last bond, adenosine triphosphate. Here's your adenosine and then 3 phosphates. This last bond between these last 2 phosphates is not very stable. When it breaks, we end up with energy. So we use that energy to make the actin or the myosin ratchet, okay, to active transport, to work something against the gradient. We break the bond, we make energy. Break the bond, we make the energy. We break this bond, we get physical energy that we can use to do work. Here's just a very more technical molecular model of ATP. You don't need to worry about it in terms of detail. All right, so this chemical equation, I couldn't make this a double arrow. This arrow goes back and forth. So ATP, adenosine triphosphate, we break, we break that last bond. We end up with adenosine diphosphate, 2 phosphates, plus a phosphate, plus the energy. Okay, plus the energy. Now, it can go 2 directions. So what we do is when we want to do work, we go with this direction. To do that work again, we need to remake an ATP. So instead of creating a new one, we're going to recycle this one. So what we're going to do is take a glucose or take a fat. We're going to break a bond between two carbons, either in a carbohydrate or in a fat molecule. We break a bond between carbons. That gives us energy. We're going to use that energy to put the phosphate back on the ADP and give us the ATP all over again. Then we can use that ATP, break that last bond, go in this direction. Then we can use the fuel nutrients to get energy to put the phosphates back on ADP and then re-get ATP. So we go in this direction. We use the energy from breaking this bond to do work. Then we use the energy from the food we eat by breaking bonds in a glucose or a fat, take the energy from breaking those bonds to put the phosphate back on the ADP to then get ATP. So we can go in either direction, boompy boompy boomp or boompy boompy boom. Okay, so we use the energy from the food we eat to put the phosphate back on. Then once we have this, we can then go in this direction, break that last bond on the phosphate to end up with an extra phosphate and energy to do work. So cells use the produced energy to do the work. Okay. So basically we use carbs, fats, and proteins to make more ATP, to give us the energy we need to put the phosphate back on the ADP to get ATP. So cells don't use carbs to do work. Cells use carbohydrates and fats to make ATP, and then the ATP does the work. So cells use the carbs and fats to make energy to put the phosphate back on the ADP to give us ATP. Once we have ATP, then the ATP is then done to do the work. ATP is used to do the work by breaking that last bond with that last phosphate to give us energy. If you need to, go back and listen to the last minute on this slide so you understand the direction it's going. All right, what we're using, which direction are we using when we use the carbohydrate to make ATP? We're going this way. Once we have the ATP, we go this way. Okay, so if you need to go back and listen to that again, go ahead and do so. Okay, so where does this all occur? It occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell and the mitochondria of the cell. So we'll be talking about the cytoplasm here and the mighty mitochondria. Remember back to AMP1, we talked about the mighty mitochondria and how you make ATP. Okay, you make ATP. So now we're going to go through the very basics of how that is done. So here's the mitochondria. Some of what we're going to talk about is going to be in the matrix in the center here. Others, the electron transport is going to occur on this inner membrane right here. Okay, so this is the mitochondria, the mighty mitochondria. Okay, let's look at the basics. To use fat and to use carbohydrates, we're going to start with glycolysis. Just to review here, glycolysis is the breakdown of glucose. Okay, we're going to break down glucose. We're going to start breaking bonds in the glucose. Okay. This occurs in the cytoplasm. We're going to break bonds. If we have oxygen present, we're going to end up with pyruvate. Pyruvate is then going to enter the mitochondria. We're going to do the citric acid cycle, which is also called the Krebs cycle. We're going to make more ATP. We're going to also make CO2. We're going to make potential energy. We then go into electron transport to then make more ATP. Okay. This will make a lot more sense once I finish. So glycolysis in the cytoplasm, then into the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, same thing, to make potential energy. So we're getting some energy here, some potential energy. From the Krebs cycle or citric acid cycle, we get more potential energy. And then we take all the potential energy we've gotten here, and we then use electron transport to make a bunch of ATP. And the byproduct of that is that we get oxygen, we get water. Sorry, we use oxygen to get water. And then here, our byproduct is we get CO2. Now, if everything I just said makes very little sense, that is fine. So hopefully when we come back to this drawing, it will make a little more sense. Okay, so the first step is glycolysis. Lysis is the breakdown of glucose. We're going to break bonds between the carbons of the glucose to make energy. Okay, to make energy. We are also making what we call potential energy. When I say potential energy, these molecules here, the NADH, those are potential energy. They have potential energy, which means they can be used later on to make ATP. Okay, they can be used later on to make ATP. So we get some ATP from glycolysis, breaking down this glucose, and we also get potential energy. Okay, we also get potential energy. So we get some energy from breaking down glucose in the cytoplasm, but we get more potential energy than anything else. Okay, we also get some potential energy from this pyruvic acid. So we break down glucose, break down the bonds, we get some energy in ATP, we also get potential energy in NADH. If there is oxygen present in the cell, then we get what's called pyruvic acid. Okay. Pyruvic acid is what happens when we have aerobic metabolism, when we have oxygen present in the cell. This is also potential energy that's going to head into the mitochondria and allow us to get more ATP. Okay, allow us to get more ATP. So we're breaking bonds in glucose, we're getting a little bit of ATP, and we're getting it pretty quickly. We're also getting potential energy in the form of NADH, and if there is oxygen present, we also get pyruvic acid, which can then head into the mitochondria and will give us the potential to make a lot more ATP. Okay. All right, so it occurs in the cytoplasm of the cell, glycolysis does, produce energy quickly from the breakdown of glucose. The final product is pyruvic acid or pyruvate. They are the same thing. If oxygen is present, okay. Potential energy. So we get a small amount of ATP, but we get it quickly. We get NADH, which is potential energy, and we get pyruvic acid to make more ATP or have the potential to make more ATP. So that is aerobic glycolysis. If there is not oxygen present in the cell, what will happen is glycolysis will go one more step and we'll end up with lactic acid. Then it becomes anaerobic, okay, a lack of oxygen. So if there's not oxygen present, then we end up one more step and we end up with lactic acid, and the step stops there. Okay, the energy level stops there. We can't get any more energy from this if there's not oxygen present. Lactic acid, you've all experienced this sometime in your life. So let's say I made you go sprint up the stairs, okay, sprint up the stairs. So what's going to happen is you haven't had time to get oxygen into your cells yet. So what happens is you don't have oxygen present in your cells, and so you can't work aerobically, so you work anaerobically, so we get the breakdown of glucose, which is good because it gives you the energy quickly to run up the stairs. But because there's not oxygen present, you go this next step and you end up with lactic acid. Lactic acid is what gives you that burning sensation that you have in the muscles that you're using. Okay? So the good part about glycolysis in this situation is it gives you some ATP in order to give you the energy for the muscles to contract to get up the stairs. But the side effect, the negative part, is that you get lactic acid, which gives you that burning sensation. Okay. So if there's not oxygen present, then we go through anaerobic glycolysis, and our ability to make energy is kind of over. Okay, so you can make energy for a short period of time, which is good, but you don't get a lot of it, and then you get that lactic acid buildup. Now, that lactic acid buildup is not the reason you stop running up the stairs. It might be, but it's not what causes you to physically fatigue. Psychologically, it might make you stop, but physically, it's not what makes you stop. Okay? Physically, it's another thing that causes you to stop, but I just want you to know that. Lactic acid is also not what causes you to get sore the next day. We talked about this with muscles. That's kind of one of my pet peeves. People think, oh, that lactic acid I made. That's not what caused you to get sore. That lactic acid, actually, if you think about it, once you stop very quickly, that lactic acid leaves your muscles and goes to your bloodstream, and the burning sensation actually stops. Okay, so with anaerobic, without oxygen, boom, you go through glycolysis, you're breaking down glucose in the cytoplasm, you get some energy, which is good, but you don't get a lot of potential energy, and the system kind of shuts down with the buildup of lactic acid. Okay. Now, what happens when you do work aerobically? Well, then we have potential energy. We've got this NADH, we've got this pyruvic acid. Then we're going to continue aerobic metabolism. So the process continues on in the mitochondria if oxygen is present. Okay, if oxygen is present. Okay, so we're going to go on now to aerobic metabolism. The next step is the Krebs cycle or the citric acid cycle. And if you look here, glycolysis is in the cytoplasm. Pyruvic acid or pyruvate, same thing. If its oxygen is present here, then we can take that pyruvic acid and go into the Krebs cycle, which is in the middle, okay, in the matrix of the mitochondria. Again, this only happens if oxygen is present and we get pyruvic acid. The NADH from glycolysis will also head into the mitochondria and be used to make more ATP in the next step after this. So here's pyruvic acid. This Krebs cycle is just a step-by-step process. You don't need to know it, but here's what you need to know. What you're getting with the Krebs cycle is you're getting a little more ATP, but what you're getting more of is more potential energy. You see this NADH and you see this FADH2. This is all potential energy that can be used in the next step to make a lot of ATP. Okay? So in the Krebs cycle, you need to know where it's located. It's in the matrix of the mitochondria. You need to know what you get out of it. What you get out of it is you get a little bit of ATP, but you get a lot of potential energy that can be used to make more ATP in the next step. And the last thing you get out of this is you get carbon dioxide. Okay, so when we use oxygen, we produce carbon dioxide. This is where it comes from. Okay, this is where it comes from. You get carbon dioxide from the Krebs cycle. Okay. So again, what do you get from the Krebs cycle? You get potential energy in the form of NADHs and FADH2. You get a little bit of ATP, and you get carbon dioxide. Okay, you get carbon dioxide. You will hear me say, you use oxygen, you produce CO2. Okay. This is where the CO2 comes from when you are working aerobically. Okay. All right, so where's all that potential energy come from? Next question. And the second thing is, I keep talking about oxygen, but I haven't really showed you where it comes into play. Here's where it comes into play. It comes into play in the electron transport oxidative phosphorylation. This is the last step in aerobic metabolism. And we're going to simplify this as much as I can. Here's glycolysis, step 1 of aerobic metabolism. If you have oxygen present, you get pyruvic acid. That heads into the mitochondria along with the potential energy. Go through the Krebs cycle. You get a little bit more energy. You get a bunch of potential energy in the form of NADHs and FADH2. You get carbon dioxide. And then what's going to happen is all these NADHs, and you got to trust me on this, I'm not going to go into detail. All these NADHs are then used to make ATP. So someday you might have to learn this system in detail. Right now you do not. This is occurring right on this little wall here, the inner membrane of the mitochondria. We're going to use all these NADHs that we've made and FADHs to make ATP. Okay. Now the key here though, in order for these NADHs to then be used to make all this ATP, you have to have oxygen, and here's where it comes in. Okay. You have to have the oxygen to catch all these hydrogens. Just trust me on that. Okay. If you don't have oxygen here, this will not work. Okay, this will not work. So we're going to use all these NADHs as well as the FADH that we got, H2 that we got from the Krebs cycle. We're going to use it to go through this process to make ATP. But in order to do that, we have to have a place for these hydrogens to go. The place where hydrogens are going to go is they're going to bond with oxygen to form water. Okay, to form water. So this is where we need to have the oxygen. The oxygen has to be here for this to occur. If the oxygen is not here, then this can't occur. The Krebs cycle can't occur. Glycolysis, you will not end up with pyruvic acid. You will end up with lactic acid, and then the system will stop and you can't make any more energy. So when I say you need oxygen, this is where you need it. Okay, you need it at this electron transport oxidative phosphorylation level. But if you don't have it, it kind of backs up the system. This can't work. This can't work. You end up with lactic acid, and then you're done, and you can't make any more energy. Okay. So again, what does electron transport oxidative phosphorylation do? It's going to take all that potential energy of NADH and FADHs, use those hydrogen ions to then make ATP. But in order to do that, these hydrogen ions have to have a place to go, and that's going to be on the oxygen that has to be in the cell. Now, where did it come from? First of all, you breathed it in. It went into your bloodstream. It traveled through your body using the heart. And then when it got close to a cell, it diffused into the cell. Okay? So in order to have oxygen for this to occur, it takes time. So if you start going for a jog, it takes time for you to breathe in this extra oxygen, then get it to your heart and get it to your bloodstream, and then for your heart to pump it out to your body, and then for it to diffuse into the cells, the muscle cells, in order to be used in the mitochondria for this process. Okay, for this process. Okay, so I've gone through the steps of anaerobic glycolysis. When there's not oxygen, you end up with lactic acid and some energy. When there is oxygen, you end up with pyruvic acid, which then goes into the Krebs cycle, and also you get potential energy that comes into the mitochondria. You go into the Krebs cycle. You then get the NADHs, the potential energy, the FADH2s, potential energy. They're potential energy because they can be used to make mitochondria. Sorry, they can't be used to make mitochondria. They can be used to make ATP. Okay. You get CO2 from the Krebs cycle, and you get a little bit of ATP. But then we take all these NADHs and FADHs, all this potential energy from glycolysis in the Krebs cycle, send it into this electron transport, use these hydrogen ions from here to then get us to produce ATP. But in order to do that, we have to have the oxygen to accept the hydrogens that we get from all this potential energy. If that's there, then that becomes water, but we get all this ATP. Okay. To show you the difference, if you go through glycolysis anaerobically, okay, without the oxygen present, you end up, for every glucose, you end up with 2 ATPs, which is it. If you go through it aerobically, you go through this step and then this step and then this step, you end up for 36 to 38 ATPs per glucose. So you get a lot more energy aerobically, okay, when you do that. Okay, I'm going to stop with this slide for this video. Go through it again. Again, what you're looking for is where do these things take place? Okay. What is the difference between aerobic and anaerobic glycolysis? If you go through anaerobic glycolysis, what do you end up with? If you go through aerobic glycolysis, what do you end up with? What happens when you go into the Krebs cycle? What do you get out of it? Where is it occurring and what do you get out of it? And then when you go through electron transport and oxidative phosphorylation, what do you get out of it? What do you need? What do you get out of it? Okay. So go back and watch this again if you need to and take some basic notes, okay, and then check the objectives that you have and make sure you can answer those questions. Okay, there'll be one more video on metabolism after this one.